Talking Violence. With Brad Evans. Discussing the difficult questions concerning the human condition. I was first introduced to Juliano Fiori a number of years ago. Not only did I appreciate very quickly that he was part of a new innovative unit at the charity Save the Children, which was undertaking serious and critical self-reflection on humanitarian practice, he was also a formidable emerging intellect. Juliano has worked for a number of years in the humanitarian affairs team at the NGO, a team he was actually involved in setting up. This unit has been dedicated to promoting critical reflection on humanitarianism. Perhaps in some recognition that humanitarian staff are generally more radical than the leadership, the project has sought to stimulate critical debate and is partly about seeking to democratize or at least ask more searching questions about NGOs in the 21st century. As Juliano openly explains, he has never seen himself as an aid worker as such, more as an ethnographer of the aid sector, a kind of inside observer, albeit with some investment in the game. Indeed, as he noted to me, he was drawn to studying and working with humanitarian NGOs, not so much by a compassionate calling, but out of a curiosity about the place they came to occupy in society, especially the hold they seem to have over the moral and the political imagination in the West. As an active researcher, Juliano has since focused on the relationship between humanitarianism and politics, the function of humanitarian reason in historical processes, and the development of liberal capitalism. He is one of the editors of a forthcoming book on humanitarianism and liberal order entitled Amid the Debris, to which I have also contributed a chapter. Juliano is currently a visiting research fellow at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro's Nucleus for Bioethics and Applied Ethics, while working on an intellectual history of liberal humanitarianism at the University of Manchester's Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. Biopolitics aside, he has also once played rugby for Brazil at the Olympics. In this specific talk, Juliano draws upon his experiences of working in the humanitarian sector to provide a rich intellectual history of the humanitarian condition, notably accounting for its failures and the way humanitarian ethics are inseparable from the question of violence. However, thinking beyond the empirics of violence, what really concerns you are deeper philosophical questions about time and how we imagine what it means to be a humanitarian in a world that seemingly has no vision for the future. What, in other words, might humanitarianism mean after the death of Utopia?
In 1989, in an essay that would transform him into the emblematic intellectual of the Cold War's conclusion, Francis Fukuyama cautioned that the end of history would be a very sad time. And yet that's not normally how we remember the time in question, which has been inscribed in the collective memory of the West as one of triumph, if not triumphalism. When I've spoken to aid workers who cut their teeth around this time, they've often recalled enthusiasm for new opportunities, for an expansion of what's referred to as humanitarian space, for hopes that humanitarian space would no longer be conditioned by geopolitics in the same way. Around the turn of the 1990s, the UN General Assembly passed a number of resolutions that emphasised the role of aid agencies within states in response to disaster. In 1992, UN Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali affirmed that the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty had passed. Sovereignty was now relocated from the state to the individual, and state refusal of aid was increasingly seen as a moral transgression. As the United States consolidated an international ethical order arbitrating over what was to be considered good and what was to be considered bad. Humanitarians became protagonists of a story told by the West about itself. The aid industry remained minuscule in relation to commercial industries with comparably sized workforces. But having garnered media attention through spectacular relief campaigns, Live Aid in particular, aid agencies became subcontractors for the West's moral conscience. Western states now saw more strategic value in humanitarian language, in humanitarian ideas. Humanitarian concern was readily invoked by Western states in justification of military intervention, so-called humanitarian interventions, on the periphery, but in particular along what Mark Duffield has called Europe's security frontier. Aid agencies often cheered on these interventions, even though many aid workers felt uncomfortable about their entanglement in geopolitics. When people think about and discuss the relationship between humanitarianism and politics over recent decades, they often focus on the way that humanitarianism has been transformed by politics. A lot has been written on the political instrumentalization of humanitarian action, not least by disgruntled aid workers themselves. Much of this is important work, although it often plays into golden era narratives suggestive of the idea that there was a time when humanitarianism was unsullied by politics. I'm less interested, though, in the politicization of humanitarianism than I am in the humanitarianization of politics. Indeed, I think it's only through an understanding of the latter that the former has any historical meaning. And so that's what I'm going to focus on here. The emergence of what I've referred to as the society of the humanitarian minimum. That is, a society in which a right to survival, freedom from necessity, constitutes the height of collective expectations. Weaving together a few different threads, I'm going to try to give a sense, albeit a partial one, of what this society is, maybe what this society was, and how it came into being. In doing so, I'll reflect on the material basis of changing intellectual dispositions, social expectations, and political imagination in the West, on the dialectic of liberal utopia in an age of fictitious capital. And I'll also consider the place of violence in this society. On the one hand, the centrality of the negation of violence to its justification narrative, and on the other, the exercise of violence in sustaining it. So I'm going to start with those whose image is brought to mind by the term humanitarian, with Western aid workers and their contemporary history. There's been something of a boom in the production of humanitarian histories over the last 15 years or so, and a certain diversification of the historiography. But Anglo-American accounts remain dominant, and they tend to emphasize the end of the Cold War as a moment of rupture. But I tend to think that it's necessary to go back a little bit further when exploring the rise of a new humanitarian politics, situating it in the capitalist crisis of the 1970s. Doing this can allow for closer consideration of the relationship between humanitarianism as it merged with human rights and neoliberalism. It can allow for closer consideration of the relationship between the new moral politics and counter-revolution. This way, humanitarians aren't so much seen as the objects of political manipulation. They come to be seen more as agents in the political and cultural transformation of their professional universe, and indeed of society. Aid agencies then can be seen as sites of a hybrid radicalism, which combined moral idealism and professional aspirations. Among those who do root political humanism in its contemporary cosmopolitan form in the 1970s, Samuel Moyn is perhaps the most prominent. But Moyn focuses mostly on human rights. In his iconoclastic revision of human rights history, The Last Utopia, he refers to human rights and humanitarianism as fused enterprises, the former incorporating the latter and the latter justified in terms of the former. But subsuming humanitarianism within human rights in this way would tend to reaffirm a very contemporary conceptualization, according to which humanitarianism is understood as a field of operational activity across border in response to conflict and disaster. If this doesn't deny the political forms that concern for human suffering has taken in recent decades, it does tend to obscure the way in which minimalist humanitarian reason has redefined human rights and has even reshaped the public sphere. So it's perhaps worth me stating here that so as not to strip humanitarianism of its colonial connotations and its contribution to the European geoculture of progress, I tend to take a broader understanding of it as a universalist politics of human life. One historian who situates the rise of a new humanitarian politics in the 1970s is Eleanor Davey, and she focuses on the French experience. She discusses the emergence of sans-frontiérisme in the moment of disillusionment with tiers-mondisme, the former being a movement or ideology associated with a mode of humanitarian activism and ultimately with Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF as I'll now refer to them, and the latter being Third Worldism. And she recounts an episode that is particularly revealing of a disposition that I'm trying to connect here to broader processes of social and political change. MSF was established in 1971 by a group of French physicians who had been actively involved in left-wing politics but had sought new channels for their idealism. In the 1980s, the organisation expanded with new branches in other European countries. In May 1984, the General Assembly of the French branch of MSF established Liberté Sans Frontières, LSF, which was a think tank that would become involved in debates about human rights and development in the Third World. By now, MSF was perhaps the most iconic of humanitarian agencies, and this is partly because of the way it had spoken out against the Khmer Rouge and then the pro-Vietnamese government that succeeded it, against Soviet attacks on journalists and aid workers in Afghanistan, and against mass relocation in Ethiopia. Speaking out in this way reflected not only the sans-frontiériste principle of témoignage, that's bearing witness, but it was also motivated by an evolving interpretation of what humanitarianism actually was, an interpretation of it as anti-totalitarian and even anti-communist. The driving forces behind LSF were Ronnie Broman and Claude Malhuret, who were respectively the president and director of MSF France at this time. They'd both been involved in the mobilisations of May 68, but they'd abandoned their left-wing politics and Third Worldism. So to put this in a bit of historical context, this comes at the time when leftist autocritique, which had been galvanized by the Padilla affair in Cuba and then the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, had been channeled into a stream of invective against Third Worldism. Broman would later admit that LSF had been set up precisely to get involved in the fight. And yet Malhuret in particular had been very keen to present LSF as neutral and grounded in the practical expertise of humanitarian medics. But both were certainly in agreement that there was a necessity to abandon Third Worldist ideology and in fact to substitute ideological politics in general for a moral politics. In January 1985, LSF hosted a conference that was controversial for lining up critics of Third World developmentalism and anti-imperialism. Many of those who spoke vituperated the structuralist theories that they saw as blaming the West or Western capitalism for underdevelopment. The LSF statute also rejected these theories, and it rejected the idea of a third world. Instead, LSF blamed oppression and suffering on the periphery on bad local governance or human error. In doing so, it expressed a technocratic preference for neoliberal political economy, representative democracy, and human rights. So claims that LSF was free of ideology seem to belie its captivity to the counter-revolutionary zeitgeist. In his address to the LSF conference, Broman discussed the demise of political messianism, but the morality of urgence that he imagined emerging in its place would also become the object of a messianic faith, associated with what another participant at the conference, political scientist Olivier Roy, called the refusal of the historical perspective. The morality of Urgence bore a promise of universal humanity, of freedom from necessity and a right to life, and as such it represented a historical resolution. If Broman, Malhuret and their co-travellers explicitly renounced past ideals, they didn't renounce moral idealism. Energies invested previously in revolutionism would now be directed towards the pursuit of a new alternative utopia, what I understand as a negative utopia, insofar as it was a negation of the past or past utopias and their pathologies. It was also a negation of the future insofar as it allowed for no further political contestation. The only utopia permissible now was a world without utopianisms. For a time, this would align Broman and others with the neoconservative project to spread liberal democracy. In the 1970s and 1980s, aid agencies rooted in the less radical Anglo-American philanthropic tradition, such as Save the Children, Oxfam and CARE, were far less zealous advocates of counter-revolution than MSF France, even though they'd been faithful allies of anti-communism. But their millenarian enthusiasm would become clear into the 1990s. Drawing on long-standing association with Western governments, they placed themselves at the forefront of efforts to impose liberal peace on the periphery. And more developmental in approach than their French counterparts, they were readily integrated into stabilisation strategies. While MSF's commitment to independence and critique usually distanced it from multi-agency initiatives, Anglo-American agencies collaborated to accelerate professionalisation in the aid sector, which was enabled by increased funding for emergency relief from government and from private sources. Around the turn of the 1990s, donor governments started making more demands of aid agencies to evaluate their programs, to give a clearer idea of their impact. Then in the 1990s, perceived failures in coordination and in technical proficiency by aid agencies themselves contributed to a number of initiatives aimed at improving humanitarian effectiveness. This agenda was heavily influenced by the neo-managerial reorganisation of Western government bureaucracies over the previous decade, and professional performance in the aid sector would increasingly be defined now in terms of business principles, that is, efficiency, productivity, accountability, value for money. This marked a considerable commercialisation of the aid sector, but it also produced a humanitarianisation of professional cultures. With greater opportunity to develop professional careers in charity, aid agencies exported a professional expertise imbued with humanitarian morality. In doing so, they became preeminent, if often unsuspecting, missionaries for the Society of the Humanitarian Minimum. By the turn of the millennium, aid executives were no more out of place in the world of business than Bill Gates was in the aid sector. Samuel Moyn's discussion of the last utopia is relevant when considering the messianic character of the new humanitarian politics that emerged in the 1970s, even if, as he has since admitted, the claim that human rights emerged seemingly from nowhere surely exaggerates their originality. But if human rights emerged historically as the last utopia, I'd suggest it's not only, as Samuel Moyn argues, because other visions imploded. It's primarily because they reflected an idealism defined by the negation of other utopias. As a minimalist conception of human rights drew support from disenchanted utopians, its success constituted a drawing in of the horizon of social change, a reduction of social expectations. Relief from necessity now became a utopian maximum. The realm of freedom could now be sought within the realm of necessity, as Herbert Marcuse argued in 1967, inverting Marx's famous formulation. I'd now like to indulge in a bit of a digression, so as to introduce the theme of violence, and I'll take necessity as my starting point. If we look back at revolutionary movements from the early modern period onwards, we can see the demand for relief from necessity as providing an impetus to rupture from the status quo. What German sociologist Karl Mannheim called otherworldly objectives can inspire a dispute to transcend a particular reality, but they can't themselves provoke the critical moment. The impetus to rupture is produced by a pursuit for conditions that are radically available within the status quo, but precluded by its custodians. That is, it's produced by a necessity that can be recognised by an existing subjectivity. On these terms, necessity itself, not just the conditions that produce it, is pregnant with the possibility of utopia. German philosopher Ernst Bloch identified a relationship between necessity and utopia. For Bloch, utopian possibilities were the product of a dialectic between necessity and contingency. Hope, then, was born of mundane efforts to overcome necessity, primarily hunger. In this regard, Bloch was in agreement with Macheath, the protagonist in Bertolt Brecht's The Threepenny Opera. Grub first, then ethics. In The Metaphysics of Morals, written in 1797, Immanuel Kant invokes the legal maxim, necessity has no law, in order to argue that there are circumstances in which the law can't prevent a necessary wrong. In other words, there is a right of necessity that exists beyond the law. This right of necessity was claimed by Robespierre a few years earlier, in December 1792, shortly after the foundation of the French First Republic, when food shortages and inflation were putting pressure on the Revolutionary Assembly. It was also claimed by slaves who took up arms, most notably during the Haitian Revolution, whose contribution to modernity is too often overlooked. In this latter case in particular, the claim to a right of necessity, that is, the claim to an exception, can be seen as a decision in the strictest sense, that is, a cutting off from the status quo, by any means necessary, to use an idea from a later time. For Marxists, the decision relates to revolution. But for Marx, there were certain historical conditions which needed to emerge in order for this decision to be enacted. This conception was challenged by certain black radicals of the 20th century, like Frantz Fanon and C.L.R. James, who considered that it centred, if not prioritised, Europe in the struggle to overcome capitalist oppression. For Fanon, the decision, which relates to violent rupture, was the product of a dialectical relationship with colonial violence. In The Wretched of the Earth, he refers to the narrow world of the colonised subject, strewn with prohibitions, which could only be called into question by absolute violence. But the common starting point for colonised peoples, he argued, was bread and land, necessity. Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote the preface to The Wretched of the Earth and arguably radicalised its proposition, similarly suggested a dialectical character to violence in his Critique of Dialectical Reason. And he also thought that need and scarcity were the Manichaean basis of action and morals. What I'm trying to get across here is, firstly, that relief from necessity can be understood as the base of all modern utopias, the first objective whose attainment creates possibility for broader social transformation. And secondly, that rather than being dependent on a particular stage of historical development, violent rupture from below is always a product of the relationship with systemic violence, a systemic violence that denies relief from necessity. The notion that such violence from below could be not only intentional, but part of a broader logic, was rejected by Hannah Arendt, for whom violence was always instrumental, it was compulsion. In her 1969 essay On Violence, Arendt criticised both Fanon and Sartre, at least misinterpreting the former. She thought that revolution could be justified to overcome political repression, but she didn't think that material problems of necessity, the social question, could be resolved by violent revolution. For Arendt, the realm of necessity was the household, the private sphere of reproduction, what she called the sphere of labour. One of the most original and incisive of Cold War liberal intellectuals, Arendt exercised considerable influence in her efforts to delegitimize social revolutionary violence. Those involved with LSF drew inspiration from her, as did many former leftists in the 1960s and 1970s. Like the LSF statute, Arendt argued that the Third World is not a reality, but an ideology. And Broman has said that Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, had a particularly profound effect on him when he was weighing up how to respond to mass relocation in Ethiopia. What emerges across the West in the decades following the Second World War, as utopian projects were disavowed, is a broad denial of what Mao Zedong saw as the Marxist principle that synthesized all others, that to rebel is justified. Revolutionary violence was to be rejected, and therefore it was necessary to ensure the provision of relief from necessity. It's in the 1970s, amid capitalist crisis, oil shocks, the collapse of Bretton Woods, stagflation, mass unemployment, that this became the basis for a new post-welfarist social pact. What can be considered a biopolitical pact, to borrow a concept from Brazilian philosopher Rodrigo Nunes. Society accepted the promise of a right to life, to survival, in exchange for the concession of meaningful political agency. And it was on the success of this social pact in preventing violence from below that the legitimacy of the emerging social order was staked. That is, the legitimacy of the society of the humanitarian minimum. Okay, end of digression. We're back to the 1970s. So I've discussed the rise of a new messianism among humanitarians, negative utopianism. The suggestion that theirs can be considered the last utopia can now be supported by the idea that what became a maximum of social expectations had been the base of modern utopias, that is, relief from necessity. The reduction of social expectations to that which was available in the present, of course, had implications for society's sense of the future, for historical consciousness, and for its relationship to time. And that's what I'm going to turn to now. I've already mentioned that at the LSF conference in 1985, Olivier Roy referred to the refusal of the historical perspective. Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history, which was published in its initial shorter version 4 years later, came at a critical juncture, 4 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the general idea of a resolution of historical process, of course, had precedent in modern philosophies of history, most notably in Hegel. Even more explicitly in the mid-20th century, in the Hegelian philosophy of Alexander Kojève, on whom Fukuyama leaned heavily. Numerous European intellectuals reflected on a dead end of history around the same time as Kojève, as documented in Lutz Niethammer's book Post-Histoire, which was written a couple of months before Fukuyama published his essay. Endism and the idea of historical closure were given expression in pop culture in the 1960s and 1970s as old utopias dissipated. Indeed, Fukuyama's thesis can perhaps be considered the high point of the inverted millenarianism that Frederick Jameson associated with postmodernism, a sense of the end of this or that. Brazilian philosopher Paulo Eduardo Arantes has argued that a new relationship with time and history started to take form earlier. What he calls the new time of the world was heralded by the First World War, the first systemic crisis of progress, and then definitively inaugurated in the 1970s. This new time, he suggests, is characterized by diminishing expectations. More specifically, it was brought about by the erasure of the difference between experience and expectation, identified by German historian Reinhard Koselleck as history in general and the condition of modernity. Presentism then has made of the new time of the world an age of emergency. The endless extension of the present turns survivalism into a basic mode of existence. Arenches draws a connection between the two meanings of the Portuguese word emergência, emergence and emergency. The emergence of economies on the periphery of the world system seems to signal that a dystopian future has arrived for everyone. So it's not that the periphery has caught up as such, It's that the capitalist core has developed pathologies of the periphery. With capitalism having spread from Europe to the farthest reaches of the globe, there's a sense that everyone's running, but there's nowhere left to go. And so acceleration occurs in the present, giving a sense of emergency or urgency. The temporal horizon here is also a spatial one. In modernist terms, the future only seems possible if there are territories, worlds, utopias, left to be colonised by capitalist modernity. Europeans have often imagined utopias taking form in those territories where their own civilization has not yet been fully imposed. The New World, distant settler colonies, the Third World. But into the second half of the 20th century, capitalism seemed to be reaching its outer limits. It seemed to be reaching its inner limits too. Hopes of permanent growth and full employment in the aftermath of the Second World War were soon undone by a rapid drop in the rate of profit in the largest capitalist economies, starting in the 1960s. And a return to profitability was undermined by the very conditions of late capitalism, as analysed by Ernest Mandel. A tendency towards overcapitalisation and automation, the international concentration and centralisation of capital. As the very conditions that had led to a sense of historical closure also threatened accumulation, the Western bourgeoisie provoked a counter-revolution. A preventive counter-revolution, as Marcuse argued, because there had been no previous revolution and there was none in the offing. In order to create new opportunities for profit, this counter-revolution targeted the institutional basis of previous social expectations. Even before neoliberalism had become the dominant technology of accumulation, counter-revolution was evident in efforts to undermine the social state and a collective sense of society, when necessary, through overt physical violence. So it's inevitable that neoliberalism plays an important role in my argument. Dismantling the social state was key to reducing social expectations. But neoliberalism isn't so much about reducing the state as it is about transforming the state into a guarantor of private accumulation. According to Quinn Slobodian, early neoliberals sought not to liberate markets, but to encase them, to inoculate capitalism from the threat of democracy. In his excellent history of neoliberal globalism, Slobodian relocates the intellectual centre of gravity of neoliberalism from Milton Friedman's Chicago School to what he calls the Geneva School, which included figures like Friedrich von Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke. He provides a compelling account of the intellectual origins of the project of neoliberal globalization. But there's much that his book can't and doesn't cover as a history of the neoliberal present, not least the many contingencies in the way that neoliberal strategies came to be implemented in the West. An important element in my story is how other tendencies within liberalism's broad church contributed to neoliberal hegemony and the humanitarian politics that came to complement it. In the middle of the 20th century, intellectuals in the Anglosphere sought to reinvent liberalism, bolstering it against totalitarianism. As Duncan Bell has noted, liberal history was revised, stretched back to the 17th century or further, so as to present liberalism as the constitutive ideology of Western civilization. John Locke was reinvented as the founder of liberal thought. In a forthcoming chapter, entitled The Legitimation Crisis of Liberal Order, Simon Reed Henry discusses another aspect of this liberal reinvention. He focuses on what he calls the ethos of political minimalism, arguing that in the decades straddling the Second World War, a reductive disposition developed among liberals, particularly in the United States, who rejected the idea that freedom, individual freedom, had to be balanced against the demands of equality. These liberals often saw utopianism as leading inevitably to totalitarianism. This negative turn within liberalism was identified by the political theorist Judith Shklar in her 1957 book After Utopia. Shklar would come to embrace what she called a liberalism of fear, but at this stage she suggested that without a minimum of utopian faith, liberalism became inwards-facing and conservative. She connected liberal disavowal of utopian projects not so much to Western opposition to the Soviet Union, but to a minimalist disposition among liberals of the 19th century who favoured a negative conception of liberty. Reid Henry points to a number of liberal intellectuals who embodied this political minimalism. Prominent among them was Reinhold Niebuhr, a social, albeit sometimes conservative liberal, inspired by Christian ethics. Niebuhr saw utopianism as dangerous. As his influence grew from the 1930s onwards, he adopted an increasingly defensive position with respect to liberty, even advocating state violence to protect and expand it. Political minimalism also found expression in early neoliberalism. In the name of a stripped-back conception of liberty, neoliberals like Hayek sought to secure the market against totalitarian influence. Niebuhr and Hayek had differing views on the social role of the state, but they both prioritised freedom over equality, and they both saw that the state had a role in ordering society. Another highly influential figure, whom Reid Henry identifies with political minimalism, is John Rawls. In his Theory of Justice, published in 1971, Rawls ultimately relegates equality by establishing a hierarchy between inequalities for the sake of preventing social violence. Reid Henry notes that political minimalism is not the same thing as sufficientarianism, which provides a base level of social protections. But I'd argue that the two are complementary. Political minimalism provides a rationale for the restriction of democratic rights, on which, in the last quarter of the 20th century, the biopolitical social pact came to rely. And it contributed to the restriction, if not the subordination, of politics. So, having considered dispositions that reflected and influenced the social arrangement that emerged amid the crisis of the 1970s, and having considered material processes that contributed to producing these dispositions, I'm now going to briefly discuss the concept of the society of the humanitarian minimum itself. Let me return to preventive counter-revolution, with particular attention to its effects. As I've suggested, in the decades after the Second World War, the Western bourgeoisie, dependent on colonization for its reproduction, sought new frontiers for accumulation. Its response contributed to deindustrialization. Deindustrialization in those economies where industrial capitalism had first come about is arguably a result of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But I'd suggest it also reflects a particular directionality in the process of capitalist development. In the 1980s, banking deregulation and import promotion, particularly in the United States, contributed to a huge expansion of the financial sector. New financial derivatives and fast trading contributed to the exponential growth and circulation of fictitious capital. Financialization is usually associated with the opening outwards of globalization, but it also provided the Western bourgeoisie with an opportunity for an accelerated expansion inwards. As government and finance consolidated their old alliance, the pursuit of monopoly rent required and enabled the imposition of a new capitalist discipline for Western workers. Domestic manufacturing industries were abandoned to ruination, and prominent unions were dismantled. A new precarity was introduced into labour markets, and wages were progressively suppressed. The threat of underconsumption, then, was addressed through the provision of credit, by deregulated banks, but also by the state, which was placed at the service of neoliberalism. In play here is something like the boomerang effect of imperialism, identified by Hannah Arendt, Aimé Césaire, Sartre and others. The expansion inwards of Western capital brings home social conditions of underdevelopment imposed on the periphery. Extreme disparities of income, chronic underemployment, urban informality, violence, something like Brazilianization, to use a concept that became popular among sociologists around the turn of the millennium. By the 1980s, social fragmentation was both an objective of the neoliberal bourgeoisie and an increasingly apparent consequence of the implementation of neoliberal policies. But Thatcher's famous affirmation that there's no such thing as society was of course a sleight of hand. In one sense, despite the dismantling of unions and the universal welfare state, despite the destruction of the institutions of social solidarity, This could be seen as the moment of society's apotheotic victory. That is, if we consider the social-cultural project that has historically defined the Western bourgeoisie. In Critique and Crisis, Reinhard Koselleck's classic text on the Enlightenment challenge to the absolutist state, he discusses a dualist conception of the world, according to which, in the 18th century, society, the private, secretive, interior forum of the ascendant bourgeoisie, where morality prevailed, was constructed in opposition to politics. Bourgeois society eventually broke out from the salons and Masonic lodges where it first took form, and did so violently, with the aim of subordinating politics to a moral order. It's the influence of another Thatcherite dictum that's perhaps most indicative of the triumph of bourgeois society following the counter-revolution of the 1970s. The notion that there is no alternative suggested a subordination of politics. Many critics of neoliberalism focused on the new primacy of economics, but I'd suggest the rise of moral reason was perhaps more instrumentally significant. The moralization of the public sphere created an enabling environment for the transformation and the expansion of the economic realm. With economics taken out of political contestation, the moral question pertained to the adaptation of society, and of individuals in particular, to changing social conditions. It pertained on the one hand to the development of character and a hyper-individualistic notion of freedom within the market. This has become clearer in recent years, as even many low-wage workers have embraced what Byung-Chul Han calls the logic of self-exploitation, according to which flexible, autonomous labour, gigging, is imagined as liberation. The moral question also pertained to a sentimental, charitable response to human suffering, to a humanitarian concern that reflected contemporary conceptions of individuality, that ensured that those who didn't have the character or the means wouldn't be left behind, that their very survival would allow them to pursue freedom within the market. It was to this endeavour that the majority of moral idealists came to dedicate themselves. In the 1990s, there was a huge expansion of the charity sector, to which poverty reduction at home and abroad was increasingly outsourced, in line with the neoliberal imperative to reduce the size of the social state. What remained of social policy came to be directed towards the most vulnerable, the most marginalised, shaped by the demand for poverty targeting. Brazilian economist Lena Lavinas suggests that poverty targeting as a policy approach has its roots in military planning, and that it rose to prominence in the sphere of social protection via the bureaucratic reforms of Robert McNamara at the US Department of Defense. But it's also based on the same principle as humanitarian triage, in use in medical responses to conflict, at least since the Napoleonic Wars. That is, the principle that the assistance of those deemed most in need should be prioritised. Poverty targeting reshaped the policy agenda of European social democracy in the 1990s. It then found poster boys in Latin America, in Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, and in particular in Brazil, where conditional cash transfer programs were credited with reducing extreme poverty. Eventually championed by the World Bank, such programs came to be the intuitive social policy complement to neoliberal political economy. I'd like to finish with some further reflections on violence. I've already suggested that the legitimacy of the society of the humanitarian minimum was staked on its ability to prevent violence, in particular what can be considered violence from below. But the preservation and expansion of this society have also depended upon violence. I should state here that I don't take violence to be limited to physical brutalization, to what Jacques Derrida referred to as empirical violence, to war in the colloquial sense. Rather, I take it more broadly to be an expression of force that, in the context of a clash between notions of right, subjugates one to the other, with the implication of its eradication. Violence always implies annihilation, ultimately that of a form of life. I make a heuristic distinction between two types of violence in relation to the society of the humanitarian minimum. On the one hand, violence of this society, and on the other, violence in it. By the former, I mean the violence used to bring this society about and to sustain it, but also the violence exercised in its modes of production and reproduction. By the latter, I mean the violence born of conditions that derive from the former. Of course, I won't try to address the different manifestations of these two types of violence. I'll just try to give a sense of the interplay between them. And I'll start with the former. The process of counter-revolution in the West was, of course, frequently violent. Think of the state repression of protests and worker mobilizations in the decades following the Second World War, police action to crush strike movements, of miners in Britain, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s, the violence of Italian police during the so-called Hot Autumn of 1969, de Gaulle's response to May 68, but also the reassertion of the colour line, which set the racial limits of inclusion within the capitalist present. Police repression of civil rights and black liberation movements in the US, beyond Jim Crow, and the violence of the British state response to black uprisings against police racism in Brixton, Toxteth and elsewhere in the 1980s. On the periphery, counter-revolution took a more sanguinary form. The military coups of Latin America provide an obvious example. They too were about social expectations, but they were also bound within a systemic logic that demanded a new shock when existing relations of dependent capitalism could no longer sustain Western economic expansion. Like the violent repression of national liberation struggles in decolonizing states, counter-revolution on the periphery was also, of course, influenced by Cold War geostrategy. As Simon Reed Henry points out in his essay, the defensive disposition of Cold War liberalism generated demands for securitization abroad. Political minimalism found expression in the realism that often influenced US strategy during the Cold War, and it could only succeed through the annihilation of communist influences on political imagination. But it also contributed to a logic of military expansionism, which, after the Cold War, charged the hubristic overseas adventures of neoconservatives. Protection of the minimum itself, its legitimacy as an ideal worthy of universal recognition, came to require a vast imperial web through which violence could be exercised preemptively. Even in the moment of its putative triumph, following the Cold War, political liberalism's growing obsession with order seems to have been expressive of a vulnerability, the exposure of its limits. The society of the humanitarian minimum was ordered through a legalism whose end was the suppression of social rights from a previous era, a violence in itself enabled by direct punitive violence. What Walter Benjamin called law-making violence, mythical violence, would be used to exclude people from the political realm, first through the degradation of workers' rights, then through the expansion of the surveillance state, and then through the precognitive cybernetic determination of consumer and voter behaviour. It's what, through periods of economic crisis, sustained the biopolitical pact that seemed to guarantee the minimum of a right to life. It contributed to the sacralisation of mere life, which Benjamin had criticised, and which, serving to delegitimise violence from below, made certain lives more vulnerable, more disposable. The biopolitical pact would depend on the necropolitical management of society's margins. The particular manifestations of violence in the society of the humanitarian minimum require less attention here. It's enough to make 2 points. The first is that if those worst off in this society were occasionally driven to violent acts by their material conditions, the poor and historically oppressed were the victims of the overwhelming majority of such acts. Political and economic elites were affected by fewer direct and violent threats to their power. The second related point is that social violence was rarely directed and organised, except for when its ends were acquisitive. So that meant that when it developed overt political implications, it was more readily suppressed or co-opted. And yet, The open dialectic of violence eventually undermined the stability of the society of the humanitarian minimum. Following the financial crisis of 2007-2008, a very modern paradox contributed to bringing forth the various forms of insurgency that have challenged the erstwhile progressive neoliberal consensus over the last decade. On the one hand, lawmaking, ordering, reinforces the Weberian state monopoly on legitimate violence. On the other, the fragmentation inherent to capitalist modernity begets new sources of authority, eventually provoking shocks to re-centralise. Neoliberalism has accelerated fragmentation. It's also resulted in the outsourcing of central functions of the state. The neoliberal state has increasingly outsourced its violence, subcontracting private security firms, but also fostering parastate militarisation, arguably another aspect of Brazilianisation, as well as reactionary vigilantism. As late capitalism reduced the standard of living for a majority of people, the fragmentation of the state's authority, rather suddenly and unexpectedly, contributed to something of a revolutionary moment. It's now clear, if ever it were in doubt, that the movements best placed to take advantage of that moment were reactionary ones, often made up of nostalgists for an imagined past of grandeur. This, I'd argue, is the result of one expression of violence of the society of the humanitarian minimum that has had a more enduring effect than any other. That is, the destruction of political imagination, specifically the destruction of a post-capitalist collective imagination. As far-right groups organise themselves around common motifs, prepared to transform the state, most of those on the left were trapped in one form of liberal presentism or another, the defence of liberal institutions, or a feel-good folk politics. Unless stretched by revolutionary hopes, liberalism folds inwards into a moralism, readily exploited by forces of annihilation that lurk impatiently in the matrix of modernity. And so now, amid questions as to whether recent years have given rise to a new kind of society, the challenge is to reinvent the future. This is not just a project for the left, it's a project to revive politics in general, in the modern sense of a dispute to set expectations against and beyond a given reality. And this is an urgent project. In a here and now pregnant with pandemic disease and climate change, the struggle for a future becomes a necessary defence against extinction.
you.